evening and welcome to the 2009 Harrod Annual Lecture. We're pleased that you're here with us this evening. We hope you will enjoy the talk and join us for a reception upstairs. I'm James Hutton Boyman. Fortunately for me, Howard Harrod's former colleague. We established these lectures at the time of his retirement in 2002, and the first one was given by Beth Conkin in 2004 spring. It is good this evening then to have an anthropologist colleague to deliver the last of the Harrod lectures that we will be doing jointly with the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture. It's sort of a sad day that we're marking the end of our collaboration because of the center's going away at the end of the semester. But I want to personally thank Doug and Volney and Erica and Barbara for the 5 or 6 of these that we have done together, and we will continue them both in Howard's honor and memory and now in the center's as well. Howard Harrod's contributions to the fields of ethics, sociology, and anthropology of religion were significant. And so it was fitting, and he was well known as a graduate educator, a great professor who made not so much disciples, but people who thought for themselves in these 3 different subfields in which he worked. Again, it is fitting that tonight's lecture be offered by our colleague in the Department of Anthropology and in the Graduate Department of Religion, Tom Dillehay. And to introduce Professor Dillehay and his topic, I now call upon Doug Knight.
Thank you, Jim. My colleague Bonnie Gay sends his regrets. He's off the continent at the moment. I'm not in the United States, but not on the continent. Put it that way. Kind of narrows down the options. So we're very pleased to have as our speaker this evening one of our own, Tom Dillehay, distinguished professor of anthropology here at Vanderbilt. He came to us as departmental chair in the year 2004. He's also professor of anthropology at the Universidad Austral in Chile. Professor Dillehay is an internationally recognized specialist in archaeology, cultural anthropology, and social anthropology, all centered in Chile, Peru, Argentina, and elsewhere in the Americas. He's a scholar of many books and many honors. He's published some 15 books and over 200 articles, both in English and in Spanish. Just to give you an idea, the titles of a few of his books are The Monteverde, a Late Settlement in Chile, written in 1989. In 1991, he published The First Americans. And then in 2000, another book entitled The Settlement of the Americas, and most recently, Monuments, Empires, and Resistance, the Araucanian Polity and Ritual Narratives. His honors are exceptional. In 2007, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a very distinguished body of scientists, authors, artists, and politicians, and more. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Downing Fellow at Cambridge, has taught as visiting professor at the University of Chicago, Cambridge University, University of Tokyo, University of Leningrad, and elsewhere. His research funding stems from the National Geographic Society, Smithsonian, the National Science Foundation, and a number of other foundations as well, totaling at least $3.5 million so far. His lifelong projects in archaeology and anthropology have evolved into major new studies on political, economic, and religious history in the Americas. He's especially interested in the migration of peoples and the long processes that lead to political and social changes. He directed archaeological excavations in Monteverde, Chile, making discoveries that pointed to a much earlier date for the settlement of the New World than had previously been thought. His study of the Araucanian people of Chile and their descendants, the Mapuche, has been called a tour de force analysis of this people's resistance to the Spanish Empire. He brings to his task a subtle feel for historical movements, public rituals, and the role of religion in social and political history. Following his presentation, he will take questions, after which we will then go upstairs for the reception. It's an honor and delight to have Professor Dillehay for this lecture. He will be discussing a portion of a forthcoming book. He says is in process and is welcoming whatever pieces of insight and advice we might have to his lecture. We'll see. The lecture, at any rate, is entitled Ontology, Scale, and Time, Inferring the Origins of Andean Religion and Its Practice. Please welcome.
Colleagues say the other day when someone introduced him, such a lengthy and nice introduction, maybe I should take you with me on other talks so you can introduce me on all of them. Yeah. What I want to do this evening is speak to not so much really the origins of Andean religion and its practice, but try to distinguish between the ontology and religion through the archaeological record some 7,000 to 4,000 years ago, and how do we get to these ancient thought processes and practices with societies that do not have epigraphy or hierarchy or writing systems. I also want to take you through some philosophical ideas, through some analogies. When Dillehay invited me to give this talk, he asked me to speak to epistemology, into scales, into time differentials, because this is something that a number of the people in the center had been addressing and dealing with for several years now. So I'm going to bring those issues in as sort of methodological, conceptual notions as well. But basically, what I want to deal with here is when we look at the material record of the early Andes, one of the 6 great civilizations, independent, pristine civilizations of the world, are we looking at human intervention or divine intervention or both? And if it's sequentially arranged, which is the chicken and which is the egg? And so those are some of the issues I want to deal with tonight. This is a work in progress. It stems from building up a research database. It goes back about 30 years, and I'm still working on it. So I'm going to give you just a sample of some of the raw data that I want to get into. I'm not going to deal just with archaeology, but also with some ontological notions coming out of philosophy, looking at Heidegger all the way back to Vico in the 18th century as well. And what I'm going to do is move back and forth between some written statements and some slides. And I want to move back and forth and take you through my argument, essentially ending up with a view of power as it relates to religion and male dominance. And you'll see why I'm talking about male dominance in this Andean world. So let me start. How do we get this up on the screen? This computer's a little different from mine. It was up, yeah. Well, let me go ahead and explain the title a little bit while we get this up on the screen. Time here speaks to 2 elements. One, the archaeology and the archaeological record, going back some 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. And second, time looking at developmental transformations over several thousand years as well. Thank you. In scale, we're looking at scale and how it represents itself with micron level data up to large urban site level data, and how these scales can be used to generalize about certain processes that are taking place in the Andes as well. Ontology and religion I will explain in a few moments. So let me just looking at how do you go about assessing the origin and meaning of ancient religions without writing systems. So one's the epistemology of past religions, illiterate societies, let's say. In this particular case, we're going to use pretty much all that we have access to in the past. That's the archaeological record, and also ecological material analyses. How do we know what we know? We have to rely on analogies. We infer from analogies when you go back deep in time. These analogies have to come from ethnography. If it's the ethnography of the region that we're studying, it's the direct historical approach. But that can be a difficult issue to deal with because structures and meanings as you move from the present day back deep into the past are not always the same. So you have to be very cautious in applying this direct historical approach from ethnography to written records to the archaeological record. So we will use historical and ethnographic analogies. There's an ongoing heated debate in archaeology as to how do you interpret the past. Do you rely on Western analogies and Western models, or do you allow the archaeological record to speak for itself? I'm not going to get into the tension between these two approaches. In reality, they tend to complement each other. So there's two broad interests that we have in looking at these ancient, illiterate societies with religion and religious practices. One, we can try to get at the emotive state of individuals as they participate in religious practices, the mental constructs of religious beliefs and ritual. I don't think we can get at that some 4,000 to 7,000 years ago. We can guess at it. We can infer it, but I think it's highly speculative, and I don't think we can approach it given our current data sets and methodologies. I'm not talking about the Greeks here, and I'm not talking about the Romans or the Sumerians. We're talking about people back in deep time where we know actually zero about their religious thoughts and their practices. At a time in every civilization, be it pre-dynastic Egypt or China or anywhere else in the world, where we have very little information about what people are thinking and the way that they begin to build up institutions. A second interest would be the external role played by religious and ritual practices in organizing past societies, socially, economically, politically, demographically, ideologically as well. And here we can begin to speak to the record, and that's what I'm going to mainly address tonight, the second point. And here's where power relations come into play as well. So in the Andes, the question I have here is which one developed first? A religion or, and I'll get to this in a second, an ontology. And what I mean by ontology is an understanding that people have of themselves in their physical and social world, or you can even say their metaphysical world, their being, their reality, their perceived truth of their place in the world and their linkages with it. And that's with or without divine intervention. So in the Andes, I want to see if we can resolve tonight through the database, and not only from one site that I've been working at for the past few years, but a number of sites over the past several years, whether or not, which is one's the chicken and one's the egg, or they're complementing one another as well. The last statement here is important in speaking to the archaeology and the material record. Engagement with material signatures of the past does not give us access to past experiences and ideologies. It simply provides a basis for which we can understand how different our own world is from the past world. Some definitions, and this first definition on religion is going to dovetail with my second objective, and that is to look at the external role religion plays in organizing social, demographic, political, ideological lifeways of people, something we can control a little more archaeologically, and you'll see that as I develop this talk. This is drawn from a book called Religion and Anthropology by William Adams, published 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm not going to read the definition to you, just to hit some of the high points. Collective efforts to understand, to exploit, and enjoy unseen powers. I don't know if I particularly accept the word enjoy here, but as part of the definition. Powers would be powers that are mental constructs of the world. It can be deities, it can be political figures, it can be spirits, and so forth. It's largely through the techniques of communication. This communication would be public rituals, attending church, and so forth. The written word. Religion of any given people is the sum of their efforts to understand, exploit, and enjoy the powers in their particular environment. And underlining the word there is his emphasis. Ritual, and this is out of the book I published a couple of years ago, any religious inspired behavior. It usually involves use of religious symbols and refers to a formally specified and repeatable performance. I'm not talking about what we call ritual with birds that are preparing themselves for mating season. And I'm not talking about sports athletes coming onto the field and they do a ritual dance before they engage in play in basketball, football, or whatever. I'm talking about religious ritual. Ontology, I've already mentioned that, a nature of being, reality, or substance. People's perception of themselves within the totality of the world. Andean ontologies mostly relate to animism. And I'm taking a definition here from one of our colleagues up at Harvard, Gary Urton. It's the belief that all life has spiritual forces and natural objects have souls. So everything is active in the natural world. So let me go through a few more of these premises and assumptions I'm dealing with as I lead you into some slides I'm going to show you. In looking at some of the late pre-Hispanic and early colonial Andean religious premises, if we're looking for the origins of Andean religion, what is Andean religion as understood today? And this is primarily drawn from historical documents dating back to about the 1550s, written by the Spaniards, and their perception as theologians, military personnel, administrative individuals, working with other, some mestizo or half Quechua, half Spanish people as well, writing these documents on Andean religion, and also ethnographic groups today. Here's some of the generalities. Animated shrines, or huacas, a shrine, in Quechua the words huaca, across the landscape were venerated by a people. Landscapes were viewed as teeming with life, supernatural forces and ancestors. And these were animated landscapes that could cause fortune or ill health. Mountains, water, the Milky Way are all celestial cycles that influence people's lives. Society and culture alter with these through time and through space. Also important, ancestor worship and cults. Ancestors give living people their identity. This is an important point, that one of the points I'm going to start building on here. Corpses of ancestors were venerated and kept as sacred holdings. I've actually excavated corpses and bodies and archaeological sites that were placed on what looked like stretchers and probably brought out and used in public living rituals. And they would put these bodies back into tombs. It's very typical on the north coast of Chile and also along certain areas of the Peruvian coast too. Andean concepts did not maintain a sharp division between the living and the dead. A few years ago, I published a book called Tombs for the Living, and every article in there, whether it be archaeological, historical, or ethnographic, focused on how tombs really serve the living more than they serve the dead. And this is a point I'm going to bring up a little later as well. Commemorative declarations, offerings, and prayers and orations are the essence of Andean ceremonies. There's a whole pantheon of gods and spirits and figures in the Andean world. Now, a couple of other things I want to build on. Not only do we have to start with an idea of what is religious practice in the Andes and what is Andean religion. And the definitions I just gave you basically cover the 16th century up to today. But we're going to be going back 4,000 to 7,000 years ago. So how many of these religious practices can we detect in the past, or perhaps the origins of some of them as well? So I want to draw on sort of a general analogy out of philosophy and social science too. I've been building up, starting with Vico, one of the founders of social sciences back in the 18th century. And he identified at that time 3 principles of civil society and universal institutions of humanity: religion, matrimony, and burial of the dead. And you may or may not agree with these particular institutions, but they surely are basic to every society in history. All three serve to bind the living to the dead and the dead to future generations through the certainty, that's his word, of family genealogies. So the historical development building up here and is the linkage between ancestors, the dead, the living, and those to be born in the future, these transgenerational entities. Certainty to Vico meant that people could point to the graves of their ancestors and claim descent from that particular line, whose future would reside with future generations, unborn generations, which is all quite obvious to us. Modern day cemeteries certainly speak to this particular issue and the infrastructure and energy and expense and time dedicated to them as well in modern societies. Through the idea, and this I'm quoting Vico in here, of divine providence, unquote, which means in Latin provedere, meaning to look forward. Religious projects the future. So to him and to other men of the 18th and 19th centuries, religion meant to project forward, to connect these multiple generations. So through the injunctions to keep the genealogical line between past and future intact, matrimony, which I can't get at matrimony in the past. What I can get at are households. And I'll speak to this a little later, where you can find male and female skeletons, sometimes with the skeletons of children under the floor of the household, so I can presume we're talking about a family. Now, whether they were married or not, in non-Western, 5,000-year-old concepts, I can't speak to. So I'm going to use here, instead of matrimony, household. This seals the contract between the predecessor and the progeny in the present, past and the present. And through its devotion to ancestors and its ritual commemoration, burial institutes the past. We bury people to institute the past, connect the past to the present and to the future. So let me continue and end here on a few little points, and I want to move into some of the slides. Oh, we're off again?
Try hitting a button. It might have just timed out.
Okay. How much did we miss here?
It just the very, I mean, we saw
Okay.
this slide, so.
Let me, while we fix this, continue. Okay. So these three institutions, Vico, that they've humanized people in the social, historical, and not just the natural continuum. Natural continuum being dead, living, unborn. So he spoke of sort of a biological or natural continuum. But there's a social historical continuum here too. We all relate back to our ancestors as much as memory will allow us to, and people project in the future as well. And a lot of that's done through religion in the modern world. Now, burying the dead in the same place are repeated instances of linkages between the living and the dead to form a foundation. I've been paraphrasing, I'm just going to read this to you. To form a foundation whereby future generations retrieve their past. Burial grounds or cemeteries provide an important bedrock where past generations preserve their legacy for the unborn. I know that Heidegger, the philosopher Heidegger, is not particularly popular in all social, scientific, philosophical circles, but there's an element of his works I particularly like, and that's burial repetition is a future-directed retrieval of the past, so that the continuing theme here, ancestors, the living, the unborn, transgenerational contact. And the more that death is anticipated, the more decisively and materially people refer back to their personal heritage. That's me speaking through many years of work on death and the living in cemeteries and working with indigenous peoples as well. So, how can we move back into the past on this last slide? I've given you some of the basic premises and assumptions and generalities of Andean religion as it's understood in the written documents and in ethnographies. I've given you some general analogies drawing the dead or the ancestors to the living and to the unborn for the transgenerational effect. So now, as we move into the material record of all of this, what does religion look like in ancient societies that are illiterate and have no written records? One's location and landscape. Religious structures are usually non-domestic structures. We speak of temples and we speak of pyramids. oracles and so forth. They're almost always associated with iconography and symbols that are special. And these are usually, we'll see some of these a little later on, that are animistic, naturalistic, anthropomorphic, that relate the natural world to the celestial world of the gods and figures and humans too. There's often special floor plans. Logistics and prosemics of rituals are different from domestic activities. I mean, let's face it, a church or a temple in any denomination today is vastly different from our houses or even administrative buildings or the university. And the church portion of this very structure we're in here is architecturally and spatially different from where we're seated here. Assemblage characteristics, ritual paraphernalia, religious objects, iconography as well. What's particularly important in non-Western religious societies, although to the Catholic Church it's also important, smoke, hearths, fire pits, ritual structures. And in almost all indigenous societies around the world, fire held a particularly important role in past religions. Not all, but most. Intentional acts of demolition, restructuring, and repetition. If you look at the early art and architecture of China, Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, Mesoamerica, or Mexico, and the Andes, the 6 areas where pristine or independent civilizations developed. Everything after that was secondary, including the Greeks and the Romans, obviously. Temples are constantly being rebuilt and restructured, portions of them demolished to fit the changing ideas and changing scales of societies as well. Feasting is also important, commensal politics and religious activity. Commensal referring specifically to people feast together, and they carry out political issues as well. When at the White House, when the presidents get together with certain individuals, and they have a commemorative religious act at the beginning, which Bush did a lot of, for instance, it was part of a religious commissioning of a particular dinner or something, but it also had a commensal political viewpoint to it as well. Also associated a lot with religion, human or animal sacrifice and burials, and occasionally body mutilation as well. So now let me turn into the second phase of this talk, the slides. And in summary, what I'm particularly interested in here is ontology versus religion at the outset of Andean civilization, some 7,000 to 4,000 years ago, or is it both operating in a complementary fashion with one another? And the essence of that is, are we talking about human and or divine intervention in the things I'm going to be talking about? The analogies come from the archaeological record itself. It comes from the Andean written and ethnographic records. It comes from this sort of philosophical background I gave out of the social sciences as well, these linkages between the ancestors or the dead up to the unborn, this sort of transgenerational effect, which I think is beings in our own right, our own ontological experiences in the world. We too look to these same sorts of linkages within our own mindscapes and mental constructs. So this is Peru, which constitutes the sort of extended elbow along the western Pacific coast of the continent. And here's Huaca Prieta. But let me give you a little bit of an introduction to Andean society, pre-Columbian civilization. I think most of us, when we think of Peru, we think of Machu Picchu. This is one of many really exquisite urban sites developed by the Incas all the way from southern Colombia down to the mid portions of Chile, including nearly all of the Andes. It probably represents the world's greatest empire in terms of its infrastructure, administrative, political spread, which took place roughly over about 100 years. Unfortunately, its demise around 1515 and slightly thereafter due to the Spanish conquest. Later, we're going to push back in time now, so I'm leaving the 15th century. We're going to go back to AD 800 to 1200 years ago. This is a coast up on a site up on the north coast of Peru, the site I excavated a few years ago. This is the Pacific Ocean. You're seeing an aerial view of a massive desert city made of adobe and mud brick called Pacatnamu that dates back about 800, 1200 years ago. It's pre-Inca. So long before the Inca, there were massive urban settlements, state systems. Some were legitimized by political, economic, and religious presence. This particular culture over here called Lambayeque produced some of the world's most fantastic pre-Columbian textiles, extremely well preserved in this desert area here. The distance you see here is about 3 kilometers, and this is the sort of elite zone of residence, and here's a defensive wall here. Beyond that, the site extends. It was estimated that maybe 30,000, 40,000 people once lived here. Pushing a little further back in time, up on the north coast of Peru, where this Huaca Prieta site's located, is the Moche period, between about AD 450 and 700. Here's a large site called Tucumay, desert city as well, surrounded by agriculture in the past and today too. Here's a ramp. This is a massive 600-meter long religious structure that contains approximately 1,500 burials. I'll come back and talk to this a little later. These are administrative, elite compounds and pyramids, and the more common folk, what you might call middle to lower classes, were living out this way, back over here, and out in the countryside too. But this is a massive religious structure that was given to administration, given to religious feasting, and it's very different from anything else that you see here, and it's highly centralized. This is part of the sort of animism and naturalism, the ontology, let's say, of the Andean people as expressed in this particular form in these elaborate pottery vessels, moche, portrait vessel here. And these are representation scenes of mountains, bloodletting here, blood coming out of the head of this particular individual, sort of a chieftain-like society, individual with fangs and a feline above his head, and other individuals engaged here in this hot, teeming, sort of alive landscape that's animated and symbolic in a number of ways. This is very representational of what you see throughout the Andes and much of South America, actually, after about 1 AD. I think all of us are somewhat familiar with the Nazca lines, another form of animated landscapes. This is a 450-meter long, what's perceived to be a hummingbird. So the point I want to leave you with here is that this ontology is combined with a religious sort of landscape and symbolism and power structure that's very clearly identified in the archaeological record of the Andes from about 200 to 400 years after Christ. You can see it in the art, in the iconography, and as I'll show you later, you can see it in the burials. But before that time period, we lose it. Those signatures that I gave you of religious practices that we know in the material record in the material world are lost before about 200 AD as a composite or collective suite of signatures. The pyramids are still there, but we lose the elaborate burials, and we lose a lot of the iconography that perhaps can be interpreted as being religious. And I'm generalizing here to a certain extent. So in trying to pick this up again, let me reverse you through time. We moved back from the 15th century to about 200 AD. I want to come forward now from about 7,000 years ago or 5,000 BC on the North Coast with a number of projects I've been working on for 30 years. And what we have at about 7,000 years ago or 5,000 BC, I forgot to replace the lamp. So. There were no lamps back then. This is the foundation of a house structure that dates back about 5,000 years ago. People were hunters and gatherers. There were very simple burials, no offerings. People were just simply placed in the ground, either outside the doorway over here or underneath the floor. No art, no iconography to speak of, no pyramids, no evidence whatsoever of anything that's religious or symbols given to, I wonder if that lamp really needed replacing. I mean.
I think it's timing out. If I do this, it will come back in a
Okay.
minute. But I don't know that for sure.
And we may need to touch the mouse pad. It may just be timing out.
Okay. So So it takes a second. It takes
Yeah.
a minute
Okay.
or so once it
Yeah.
goes off. But if we can touch the mouse pad
Ever so often.
every so
Okay.
often, that might keep it from timing
Yeah.
out.
Let's do that then.
Okay.
All right? So, thank you. So what we get are a number of structures taking place at this particular time, some 7,000 years ago or 5,000 BC. We have no signatures whatsoever of any kind of religious practice. Now, I'm not saying that people did not believe in spirits or the landscape was not teeming with animated spirits and souls and rocks and mountains as we see today. I'm simply saying that in material record we have no register of it whatsoever. So we're still not appearing, huh? So.
It took almost 2 minutes left.
Oh, did it? Okay, well, I guess I'll speak to the time element in my title again then.
I can't guarantee it's going to.
Whatever you guys did back there before when you flipped the
I didn't
switch,
do anything.
Well,
like as soon as you went into that room.
when this does appear on the screen, you're going to see another simple structure. My point there is well taken, so let me move on. And when it does appear on the screen, you're going to see the site that we're currently working at, which dates back in its lower stratigraphic levels about 7,000 years ago. It's the earliest temple site in Peru. This is 28 meters from the top down to the bottom. It's 130 meters long. It's called Huaca Prieta. Here's another view of it here. We've been excavating here for 2 seasons and we'll continue to excavate in the future. Here's some of our excavations, this large block here and up here as well. What we have in the deeper levels is right by the ocean, which is out here, the Pacific Ocean, that these people are what we call maritime foragers. They would fish, they would exploit this wetland area back here, and here's the reeds that people still cut today, and people living along this particular area still pretty much carry out the kind of economy they were doing about 7,000 years ago. Exploiting the wetlands behind the beach areas, and also fishing, and they have some gardens down in these sort of wetlands areas too. About 5,000 years ago, things began to change here, and there was about 5,500 years ago, people deliberately started taking this up and it became a pyramid. And at this time we began to see burials in here. There's burials of subadults, adults, and of both genders. The site is unoccupied at about 4,000 years ago. Here's one of the large trenches that was previously excavated by a colleague back in the 40s. And we're drawing all these profiles in here. Here's one of our graduate students in the room here, Yerson Levy, and a number of other people. I'm sorry I didn't pick out a better shot. But one of the things I wanted to show you here that's quite interesting, I spoke of ritual as a repeatable performance. And what we see at this site, beginning about 5,500 years ago, are quite literally thousands and thousands of floors that were made. And you can see here these lines. These lines are representing individual floors, and these white ashy areas are representing burning episodes. We have portions of the signatures that fit the beginnings of religion. Massive architecture that's different from domestic architecture that's off of the site. We have fire pits, a lot of evidence of smoke. In the Andes, for those of you who know about the Andes, there's called chicha beer, corn beer, that were used during feasting and libations. We find pollen evidence for corn, which that's what this is at 400 microns under a microscope, only these floors that are repeatedly used or repeatedly built. In between each floor, we find sand deposits that are wind blown. So we know that the floor was used, abandoned, used, and abandoned. We've also found nothing but burial structures, and I'm not going to show you all the burials. There were burials in here and burials in here, no offerings, no art, no iconography. Again, males, females, adults and subadults, occasionally children as well. And the excavations carried out at the site back in the 40s pretty much spoke to the same thing. But let me get back here a second. What's particularly interesting, though, is that through time, from about 5,500 years ago up to the moment that the site was abandoned at about 4,000 years ago, we find intensification in the exploitation of a wide number of resources, not only along the sea lane itself, but into the interior, and also the addition of a number of cultigens, beans, cotton, chili peppers, potatoes, later the corn, as you see here, and a number of other products as well. But we still cannot speak to, other than the pyramid itself and these domestic floors, these floors that we're finding with a lot of burning, of anything that's ritually related other than these repeatable performances. We have now mapped but not yet excavated off the site, and these are conductivity, resistivity studies that we did just south of that mound, pretty much where you saw the reed laid out that I showed you before. And this is where all the houses and huts are of the people who are living off of the pyramid, and it's the support population. So what we have here is a separation of ritual activity, but I don't know if it's religious related, as opposed to domestic activity taking place out here. One of the things that's really interesting is that, and this is 400 microns under a microscope too, is that in all of we've tested a few of these areas, and in the fire pits out here, you find scirpus, sort of a reed from the wetland that's being burned as firewood. However, on the pyramid, all of the firewood is coming from the sea, and it's driftwood that's floating up onto the beach. They're drying it out, and they're burning it. So we have a separation of that portion of nature that's used in the sacred hearths on the pyramid using firewood, driftwood, as opposed to what's being used by the domestic portion of the zone, of where people reside and where they live, and that's coming from the wetlands using totora. So we begin to see this not only intensification of the exploitation of a wide variety of resources, cultigens and non-cultigens, the sea and terrestrial areas, but we're also beginning to see that they're separating public space from domestic space, public ritual space from private domestic space, and the kinds of things that go into them. Let me just say in brief, and I didn't get into it, this is a project that's got 40 specialists on it, sedimentologists and geologists and faunal specialists and everything else, so there's just a massive amount of evidence that's building up here, and we're adding to other excavations as well. So let me leave the slides and get a little bit back into some of the conceptual thoughts here. When you look at the evidence for religious signatures, we have just a fraction of that. I can't speak to a religion. I can speak to ritual, though. But I'm not sure if it's related to a religion, because certain things are absent here. The art, the iconography, no elaborate burials, no offerings, no evidence of prayer, but we do have a pyramid structure that's non-domestic, and we have these multiple repeatable layers built up in a lot of fire pits. And human burials there as well. So are we speaking about a religion that's given to the creation and employment of these unseen powers, if you go back to the definition, in the social and economic matters? That is, to sort of the external role of religion and ritual that they may have played in organizing these people, separating public from domestic space, perhaps arranging burials associated with living, ritual, repeated practices, associating the living and the dead and those to come in the near future. Or are we just simply dealing with a non-religious ontology of the relationship between natural, cultural, and social worlds? In other words, these people are simply coming together and putting their natural world that they continue to intensify and exploit more with their social world, because the site's getting bigger and it's building up more and more. And we see culture building up with this architecture. This ontology, so in other words, it may be just an ontology of transgenerational duties and responsibilities between the living and the dead. The main activity of the site is burning and burying the dead, and constantly building the pyramid up as well. We found 3 or 4 fetuses as well, human fetuses at the site, and we don't quite understand what that means with respect to the burial patterns. So Huaca Prieta, we have a landscape that has a topographic meaning. It's a landscape that's forming here. People are dwelling there too. It's an object, it's an experience, it's representing a combination of this and other things as well. And it seems to close off sort of an ontological gulf between humans at the site and the local environment. In other words, I think these people understand their place in the reality of the natural world here, what they're exploiting, what they're doing, how they're relating to each other. And if we go back to the basic premise of these other signatures of religion, we don't see that showing up at this particular time. So in relation to our modern world, let me come back to some of these analogies a little bit. In pre-modern Europe, there apparently was no great ontological gulf between humans and the rest of creation. All things were essentially believed to be sort of the creation of God's work. And the categorical separation of culture from nature and of humans from their environment can be identified with the growth of instrumental reasoning, scientific revolution during the Enlightenment period. And according to Heidegger, going back to him for a moment, he called this the age of the world picture, a period when the world is conceived and grasped as an image that can be understood by humanity. Humanity thus, during this Enlightenment period, according to Heidegger, essentially competes with God, not for creation, but for an understanding of the being's reality in their own social and natural world. So the logical or scientific vision by humanity becomes the dominant metaphor for the pursuit of knowledge. Observational science positions itself in defining reality. And at the same time, there's Cartesian geometric designs that are developing. Descartes is talking about things. There's other scientific revolutions going on. So the object and the subject are split at this time, so that humans become the active subject who begins to observe a passive nature, which is the object of science during the Enlightenment period. Humans construe nature as something which exists for them, for exploitation. If you go back to the Enlightenment period and you look at some of these divisions, you can see Emerson wrote about this and as well, of some of the issues of ecology and our perceptions of how we can exploit the environment or overexploit it in some ways as well. So we see as a home, a store of resources and an object of study and exploitation. Heidegger identifies this as a ground plan of the Cartesian worldview, a set of assumptions that renders all things open to investigation and not necessarily by God. So let me begin to wrap things up here. Although modernity has eventually seen the divine supplanted by human inquiry, we lost it again. Well, I kept hitting the button.
Kept hitting this.
Sometimes. Maybe I shouldn't have given this talk on this topic. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm inferring that Andean humanity at Huaca Prieta and a number of other sites, because I'm just giving you a sample of what we see. There's a fixed pattern. Assumed, I think, the position of sort of a privileged interpreter and observer of nature rather than the gods. And if that's the case, it may explain why we don't see art, iconography, and symbolism in the Andes, in this particular area up on the north coast, until about 3,500 years ago. We don't get it at all at Huaca Prieta and a number of other sites dating to this particular time period. We get the burials, we get the pyramids, we get the repeating burning episodes. We don't get the rest of the signatures. So what took place at Huaca Prieta along this beach of the Pacific Ocean was transformed into a built landscape through human intervention in making, and I propose not really divine intervention in creation. So it's sort of a building perspective that's coming forward here of people taking monumental architecture and repeated ritual experiences that may be in some incipient way related to religion and religious thought, and is built on the natural surface of this particular environment. So through Huaca Prieta, I think that people knitted a network of locales with which they formed a communion between nature, the living, the dead, the burial, and the unborn, those coming in the future. So it becomes, I think, an ontological place or landscape of reference to connect society, culture, and nature, again, without the materialized divine intervention. There may be mental constructs of it, but we're not getting material intervention of it. I think that's important to know because if you look at the entire history of humanity, any time that there was religious belief, it was materialized as well, not only in architecture, arts, and symbols of special places. Okay, this reference provides a means of cultivating social authority by linking multiple generations, because it hasn't come up, I won't paraphrase, multiple generations to the changing natural and social landscapes. One way that people interconnected with the land at Huaca Prieta and in the Andes was through kinship, as I talked about before. The dead, the living, the unborn, and the kinship relations between them. And through ancestry, and through cemeteries, and visiting cemeteries, and sending flowers to the cemetery on the dates of death. This happens across many generations. That is, land was and is connected with ancestry in various ways, and particularly in animated ways in the Andes. Ancestors formed the land, emerged out of the land, and are buried in the land. But it was a human-created landscape, not a materialized, God-created landscape. So the produced landscape at Huaca Prieta provided a continuous and conspicuous reminder of this relationship between the living and past generations, and consequently of lines of kinship, descent, and inheritance. So so the question I have is, which is the chicken and which is the egg? I think that we can speak to, at least arbitrarily, sort of the creation of an ontology here to a certain extent in the Andean world upon this north coast, as represented at Huaca Prieta and perhaps other sites. We don't see, I don't think, a formal institutionalized religion that put together all these suite of signatures I was talking about. I'm not saying that there was not a mental construct, but certainly not a materialized one. So at what point does the material record point to divine intervention in religion? When elaborate symbols appear and when temples are associated with elaborate rooms and burials of individuals, particularly males, presumably employing religious and ideological powers, going back to Adam's definition, to legitimize their authority. Now, I need my slides. So, then an interesting thing takes place at Huaca Prieta at about 3,800 years ago. There's no more adolescent or subadult burials based on the ones we've excavated and the ones that were excavated in 1945 for a grand total of about 57. No more female burials. They're all male burials. And for the first time, it's associated with a culture called Kupasniki at the site that dates back about 3,800 years ago, 3,500 years ago. We see offerings with these males. And at that particular point in time, this particular pyramid is shut off permanently. And another pyramid is built next to it. And one could see that in the slides. And for the very first time in Huaca Prieta, art, iconography, and symbols appear on textiles and painted gourds and etched gourds associated with these male burials. What's going on? Back then and now. So, yeah.
I'm going to try one more thing.
Please.
I don't think will work, but.
Two. Because this is sort of the concluding part here. And well, what this is showing are drawings on the textiles and the etched gourds as offerings in these male tombs at Huaca Prieta.
Suppose you could turn them around.
I said scale was part of the talk. So. Your imagination is part of it too. So. At about back to 200, 300 AD, something very interesting takes place on the north coast. And it's the earliest incident of it. We began to have very opulent, very elaborate male burials associated with gold and associated with an incredible array of offerings. Also associated with symbols, feline symbols, animistic and naturalized symbols, symbols that are believed to be representing a formally institutionalized religion. That's what, here we go. Let me back up just real quick and show you that This is at about 3,800 years ago. At the very end of Huaca Prieta, we began to get male burials associated with these designs on textiles and etched gourds. A little later on in time, through time, start picking up, and I haven't got the time or to go through all of this evidence, but we begin to see exclusively male burials in these early moche tombs associated with associate burials that are both males and females. And some of the archaeologists believe the female burials are probably slaves, female slaves, male slaves, concubines, perhaps wives, so on and so forth. This is coming from the site down here, large adobe pyramid. And later on in the Andes, we began to get all of this kind of symbolism showing up for the first time. Off to the right's a mummy burial. That these will often be brought out in the Andes, relating the living to the dead as well. So my conclusion is this. I go back to it. One, are we again dealing with an informal, perhaps mental construct of religion as particularly materialized and conceptualized through these repeatable rituals that we see at Huaca Prieta, and there are other instances of this at other sites. And the transgenerational linkage between the dead at the site, the living building the site and bringing the dead there, and then the continuous birth of other people as well. In this environment where they began to combine terrestrial resources with oceanic resources and also began to combine public, non-domestic space with domestic space too. So there's a lot of transformations taking place here. I don't see a formalized religion because, as I mentioned before, there's just too many signatures missing here. But I think it is an ontological experience, an ontological place where they're figuring their place out as a being in the social and natural world. Religion comes in later. And it's interesting that you get the combination of all of these signatures on the North Coast when males began to be buried as elite, powerful individuals, flanked by other lesser individuals that are both males and females in these pyramids and temples. What might that relate to, and why the males? Let me end on this. It's interesting that on the North Coast, several variables are coming together. Massive intensified agricultural systems, population explosion. There's a shift in the domestic and residential architecture whereby it looks like not a single families are living together again, but it looks like perhaps there are certain percentages, which we can't project right now, that might be extended families, perhaps looking at the burial records in the North Coast, maybe males taking on 3, 4, 5 wives. How do men come to power at this particular time? There's one colleague on the North Coast, some of you know, John Verano, told me, well, they kept the women pregnant, and multiple women pregnant. You don't have the population explosion that we see. About a 500% increase over 400 years in the number of archaeological sites. And the residential household patterns formed to include multiple rooms. Those are working hypotheses only, but there's some very interesting patterns that are taking place and a very abrupt shift in the burial patterns between genders taking place as well. So I end on that particular note. As I said, there were analogies that we have to deal with here, and one of the analogies I drew on in the modern sort of philosophical, social, scientific world was to look at this continuous linkage that you find throughout the literature in the Western world, Eastern as well, of the living and the dead and the unborn. And I think we see that here too. Well, I'm going to stop there. I think my time's probably just ended, but thank you.
Professor Dillehay, we'll take some questions. Just go ahead and direct them to
Questions and suggestions. As I said, this is kind of an ongoing project, and yes.
All of that extremely fascinating. One could sort of object from a Heideggerian point of view that really ontology starts with the Greeks. It's Western, and then it has its apotheosis with the Germans. It doesn't apply to other civilizations that are outside of this trajectory of thinking, being, because ontological is being and not beings, right? That's the ontological difference that Heidegger's philosophy pivots on, really. And even if we're having gods in various animistic forms. Those would be beings. It's not the dimension of the ontological in the philosophical sense that Heidegger wants to define. You know, however, I don't really want to make that objection because I think what you are getting at is really expanding the cadre of Heideggerian thinking and finding what thinking of being would mean in these civilizations that would be outside the pale for Vico as well, even though Vico is a real friend of the social sciences, as Heidegger is not. Philosophy has this thinking of being that refuses objectification, objectivity, which is really the ethos of the social sciences. So there is a strong tension there. But I would really want to go with you, I think, in redefining ontology, and Vico is probably of some help. What you're suggesting is that there's an implicit kind of ontology that's not formulated and materialized, but there's some sort of a thinking of what is, in some sense, formless. It's a mental structure, and that is maybe a common denominator of religions as languages of the unsayable, as striving towards something that does escape formulation. There's always that element, and that's perhaps the ontological element that in Western philosophical tradition is formulated by Heidegger in terms of ontology in the strict sense.
No, I agree with nearly everything you say. And what I was picking on with Heidegger was mainly his observation of repeatable variables and how they link, and his book Being in Time, the past with the living and so forth. So I was pulling that out, and he saw that as sort of the formulation of this sort of world picture, world view of the being within that particular world. And as I mentioned, there are certain things one can disagree with Heidegger on as well, and I don't profess to be an expert on him. And then there are a number of other people I've been reading too, in addition to Vico. But I think that in the literature, at least from the anthropological perspective in our literature, it's Vico that really kicks off the discussion in the social sciences on linking the ancestors and ancestry. And actually, you can spin off into a number of other individuals here too, because one thing I didn't get off into here, I think it's really important for this male dominance, population explosion, and agricultural intensification, property rights. Property responsibilities and duties, and I think that we begin to see some evidence for people beginning to demarcate resource zones, the resource territories, and property rights associated with particular population segments as well. And I know these and other individuals speak to it. That the problem we have is if it's not ontology, what do we call it? Because see, if I call it religion, then I feel like I'm wrong there as well, because the word religion didn't exist back then either. So.
Language, I believe, is what all these religions are.
Then, in no sense in me giving this talk. What language do I use? I mean, I'm serious. What if someone has a term to suggest what the antithesis of religion is here, then I will accept it.
I think in poetry it has to be really good. There's no adequate scientific language for it.
No, I agree.
To speak a poetic language, and all of the religions, I think, do that.
I agree.
One way or another.
Yes, back there? Yes.
Is it possible, or I mean, have you probably entertained the thought that 7,000 years ago there was a form of animism, but because of the rituals of appeasing the insects, the animals with food, or using materials that degraded and didn't last over time, in other words, not using clay pots or whatever, to act out their relationship with these other spirits, that because obviously if the civilizations lasted so long, or the places lasted so long and were sustainable and viable, there was this real understanding of the natural world and how to survive and keep the environment supportive of their.
Yeah, those are some of the things we're working on now and trying to figure out, the place of the human as sort of the macroorganism and this sort of ecological, environmental interplay here, and that they did survive. And not only did they survive, but they continued to develop technologies I didn't get into to exploit and occasionally overexploit some of these resources as well.
Are there descendants of these people that you can trace genetically and interview them and get their oral history?
Not right now. The population there has been mixed so much with European influence over the past several hundred years. But we're doing genetic studies on these people to see what kind of genetic signature tightness we have amongst them as opposed to others to the north and south of there and into the interior. So that's a good point, yeah. Jack? You're first.
Yeah, the idea that beliefs are materialized, I wonder, to me, the ontology being in time is very much performative. It's an activity. So I wonder whether this is just a very narrow definition of that beliefs are materialized. Maybe if they're performative, you will not find anything that lasts into our time, but they're still, I mean, if you want to call it religious, but something that was performed in those rituals.
No, I agree. That's one of the things that we're trying to get at here is what was materialized and what was not materialized. The architecture was, and taking it upward, which they didn't have to do. Vertical accretion architecturally is very different from horizontal accretion. There was a purpose or a reason for that. Probably eventually to keep the public architecture distant from and separate from the surrounding domestic architecture and domestic space. I think we can explain that. But what we do know, and you know this too, from pretty much ethnographic analogy at least, and modern day analogies, is that people usually materialize many aspects of their belief systems. People believe in Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is materialized in photographs and statues and many, many other things. But if you have a dance performance, for instance, that's not materialized, let's say in an epigraphy or painting scene or something, does that necessarily represent religion? Because I think there were beliefs, but were those beliefs religious? And I'm trying to get at, in this particular case, the development of formally institutionalized religions that relate to this transgenerational ancestry, from the dead to the living to the unborn, and what that means within this sort of existence of theirs. I won't use the word ontology, okay?
No, use it. It's good. Redefine it. You're redefining it.
I just want to say, in some way, it's very fortunate and perhaps unfortunate that you don't have text, because they just complicate life so much. For example, if you look at the first millennium in Palestine, if you go by archaeology, you can recreate a very interesting religious world.
Oh, yeah.
Based mostly on earth and women and so forth. But if you take the text that the Hebrew left us, there are no women in it except as surrogate for something or another. It's all male, the God is male, everything is male. And somehow the truth is neither here nor there, but it becomes much more difficult to really deal with issues dealing with religion on the basis of this type of a complication when you have both. And I'm wondering, what else do you have besides archaeology and ethnology and things like that to give you a sense of what religion was like?
Well, we have pretty much these signatures I was talking about, location and topography, but you know, we don't have ethnohistorical text until the mid-1500s. There is not hieroglyphics or epigraphy to rely on. And the archaeological record's problematic, particularly as you go further back in time, because the record's altered by natural forces and not everything is registered materially in the archaeological record. But on the other hand, texts are problematic because they can hide and mask and be distorted by humans who write them. So the ideal world, as you pointed out, is the combination of the two. But that's what I started out with. The text and the ethnographies will show us what Andean premises, religious premises are. But I feel very insecure about extending those back 7,000 years. Surely the structures and the meanings change significantly.
simple version of Jack's question. This is the first anthropology lecture I've heard in years. But I have trouble seeing how you make some of these conclusions. Like at one point you talked about administrative offices as though there were computers there, or, you know, file cabinets, and how could you, or even the the burial of the men. I mean, maybe there were 5 guys who robbed a bank or something, or I mean, how do you? And you said they were elites, and you thought that it significantly indicated this change, and I couldn't quite see how you could make that kind of conclusion. I like, anyway, so that's it.
Well, first of all, we're talking about 120 years of an archaeological record that's built up, with probably more than 4,000 or 5,000 burial registers that I'm alluding to, and I just didn't have the time to present everything to you. But when you find an elaborate skeleton like that last one I showed you, that pretty much occupies the top of a pyramid and is placed in there with gold and silver and pink spondula shell, and you go off that pyramid and you find just a lone skeleton with something that is on the scale of used Tupperware, we can speak to social differences, you know? I mean, if you go out today in a cemetery, if I take you out today, Sam, do you think you could infer an elite individual with the tombstone as opposed to, let's say, an African-American slave? Based on the material and spatial location.
Yeah, that's
So that's what we deal with in archaeology. We draw on analogies, but we also draw on the patterns that are identified in the archaeological record. And what you see is that these sort of administrative places are secular and separated from the temples, and they're separated from the domestic places. And these administrative places are often associated with warehouses where goods are stored. Political economy, somebody's controlling the economy. So I just didn't have time to explain archaeology. I was going to make a comment at the outset that most people, I'm not saying you do, but most of the public sees archaeology through Indiana Jones movies, and the question I usually get from the public is, well, you must have a wealth of artifacts in your house, and you must be really rich. We don't sell things at Sotheby's and on eBay, you know, and if I was that rich, I wouldn't be standing here. But it's highly scientific, and I just showed you a small sample of what we do and the logical constructs that we go through in piecing things together. And I have a lot of ideas about other things, but I don't mention them because they're highly speculative. So, any more questions, or Tom?
Tom, just a quick one. If I've got it right, if you were to condense Andean religion down to the most dense possible form, it would be this interaction of the living, the dead, and the unborn.
And the veneration of practices associated with all of that. Yeah.
I'm wondering, is that inevitable? I'm thinking about the Amazonian area where there is very little interest in the dead. There are all sorts of taboos on the names of the dead, destruction of the property of the dead, destruction of the bodies, and so forth. What gives rise to that triad in the first place? Do you have any speculations about that? And why is it not universal?
Well, I don't see that we have to have universalities everywhere, but what gives rise to that triad, we don't know. That's one of the things we're trying to pursue. It may well link to resource and property rights. One of the interesting things is, if you look at the Chinchorro culture on the north coast of Chile, some 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, they actually had pop-top tombs where they would place the bodies inside and run poles down the backside occasionally where you could lift the body out and bring it probably into public ritual with the living outside of the tomb. Then they would put it back into the tomb. Why go to this extravagant building of an infrastructure for a tomb that you can remove the body and put it back in? Plus you can see taphonomically the destruction of the body by movement and so on and so forth. We don't know, but there is a strong linkage between these three. And if you when we can presume that the unborn has a strong place there too, in this sort of transgenerational linkage. And it may not be part of the Amazonia, but the one thing you do get in Amazonia, particularly with the Ibero and the shrunken heads and other things, is this concern about capturing the spirit in some groups from your enemy. But we don't see that in the Andes. I mean, there are differences.
How about as a simplistic answer, just the preservability of the corpse? in the Andes as opposed to the tropical.
Why would you do
forests.
that, though?
I don't know. But if I had the answer, I would have asked the question.
But, I mean, what all this speaks to is the difficulty of going back in time and dealing with all this. You know, it's not easy. And we're trying to reconstruct these chapters of humanity for which there are no written words. And we have no choice but to use the concepts and the languages and the analogies that we can draw on from multiple sources. I mean, in this sense, we have to be parasites. Steve?
Well, I guess to build on that last question, build on the epistemological question, is that, you know, the way that archaeology is usually taught is that, you know, this ladder, this idea that it's to get at subsistence technologies, to get at adaptation, it's difficult to get at ritual and religion. But show me adaptation in a stone tool. Show me adaptation in a distribution of sites as a landscape. Right? So there's always a move from data to interpretation. And that's true of religion. I don't think it's any harder, actually.
No, I agree. I mean, I asked a colleague up at Harvard the other day when we were up there, who's in political science, who has the text in front of him and the language and the living people to explain the political economic policy of the cabinet of Obama right now with regard to the crises. And I got 3 different opinions. So, you know, I think interpreting human behavior is just difficult from many viewpoints.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll go to our reception.
I'm not necessarily persuaded that an early ontology isn't just a primitive religion that hasn't developed a lot. I'm not sure what you get, but I am impressed by the fact that something has changed when burial goes exploitative, in the sense that something is to be gained in the afterlife, another world, in the cosmos, for ancestors, for us, or even imaginatively that we might be buried with all our stuff at the point where the burials become very rich. And I wondered if you talk about that moment rather than the very first moment that's you know, in the dim recesses and arguable about, you know.
Yeah, very briefly, this moment when you begin to find elaborate tombs, because you have to start with an elaborate tomb that's in an elaborate location, usually in a pyramid or a temple or something, and associated with these wide array of really opulent items. That is beginning to appear sometime between about 100 and 200 AD, so the starting point is there. Before that, you rarely find that kind of burial, nothing that elaborate. It starts with this moche culture. And you don't, what we think is happening is that you start coming into individualized power structures of singular leaders, kings, lords, and this sort of thing. Before that, there tend to be group burials of men on the top of these pre-100 AD temple sites and burial platforms and structures during what we call the formative period. And that's what we usually identify as group-oriented administrators or leadership. We can't find leaders. We can find groups of leaders, but not individuals, until this one time period. All of a sudden, there's just this tremendous opulence and display of individualized power, which we think are elites. And there's a tremendously large and expansive archaeological record on this, particularly if anybody knows anything about the moche culture in Peru. Can't really explain what's going on. My personal take on it after working there for 3 decades is I again think it relates to a really rapid and widespread population increase. 2, there's a restructuring of the social organization where we move away from simple, what appears to be nuclear families, because I've excavated some of these households that are half the size of this room here, into patio groups with multiple houses around them. And there you occasionally find, it's like what cultures we call Salinar, Gallinazo on the north coast, men buried occasionally with 2 or 3 different women. So this whole notion of matrimony or family or household may be changing. It may be at a time when certain males are coming into some kind of undefined, not well understood power relation where they're taking on greater numbers of women, polygamy or something, you know. I don't know. But these are real materialized patterns that we're finding. And what we're trying to do is explain them. And we have no text to explain them. There's shifts in gender structures and gender patterns as well. I mean, I could go on and give more examples, but.
I have to follow on this is really fascinating. How would a future anthropologist 50, 100 years from now deal religiously or try to deal with all this mushrooming of cemeteries for pets? Suddenly we have them. Right? Suddenly have them in the past 50 years. Right, we have text, whatever it is. How do we explain religiously such monuments?
Well, you probably have to look at the economy, I would think, and the social role of pets within the family. I have friends who see their pets as family members. This morning, it's funny you mentioned that. I was at the vet. I have a dog that broke his foot, and my doctor out in my vet, my dog's doctor, recommended that the dog's behaviors change, and he actually gave me 2 names of a psychologist for the dog. So, how do you explain that?
I propose we do it over chocolate fondant.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to end. I appreciate it very much here. Thank you. We have a reception directly above us, one floor, and includes chocolate fondue.
The notepad, right? So are you up and running all the way now? You got license in Tennessee or whatever? You got all that, I remember. I thought it was